I would like to welcome you to this fourth session of the course, Asian and Asian American Feminist Theologies. My name is Qu'ran from Kendall School of Theology. Today's topic is interreligious learning and solidarity. We will have a webinar with 2 presentations, followed by a period of questions and answers. After the webinar, participants can join small group discussion in a Zoom meeting. I hope you will stay on and meet other participants. Please post your comments in the chat and your questions in Q&A. Our first speaker is Dr. Zayn Kassam, who is the John Knox McLean Professor of Religious Studies at Pomona College in California. She serves as the chair of both Religious Studies and Gender and Women's Studies. She has authored an introductory volume on Islam and edited 2 volumes on gender, one titled Women and Islam, and the other Women and Asian Religions. Her current research is on Muslim migration to North America. She's also the co-editor of the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. Zayn has thrice won the Wig Award for distinguished teaching at Pomona College, as well as the American Academy of Religion's National Award for Excellence in Teaching. Please welcome Dr. Kassam.
Hello, everyone. Let me begin by thanking Professor Kwok-Hui-Lan for bringing us all together to talk about Asian and Asian American feminist theologies. I am a Muslim woman who hails from Kenya in East Africa, and my family's origins 2 generations ago lie in India. While I myself found my way to California in the United States via Canada, to which my family emigrated in the 1970s. Most people, when they think of Muslim women, picture an Arab woman. However, the reality is that the majority of the world's Muslim women live in South and Southeast Asia, followed by Muslim women in Africa, followed by the Middle East. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see some of the slides that I have prepared for this presentation. Now, depending on where in the world a Muslim woman lives, the challenges and opportunities she encounters have much more to do with post-colonial realities, such as economic globalization, increasing cultural, Western cultural hegemony, a deteriorating global environment, war, and other such forces. These are the kinds of things that actually define more closely the realities in which a Muslim woman lives. Now, the second point that I want to make to you is that the Western narrative often frames all third world women as suffering privations due to the system of patriarchy in their culture or religion. Many of you are familiar with Chandra Talpade Mohanty's landmark essay, first published in 1984, in which she coined the phrase, the third world difference, which is that stable, ahistorical something that apparently oppresses most, if not all, women in these countries. And it is in the production of this third world difference that Western feminisms appropriate and colonize the constitutive complexities which characterize the lives of women in these countries, as reflective not only of their oppression, but also of Western superiority, which brings with it the responsibility to do something for those oppressed women. It is a short step from there to suggest that Islam and Muslims treat women badly, and that Muslim women are perpetually to be treated as victims in need of our intervention. 9/11 and the war on terror reinforced this notion as terrifying images of the treatment of women under the Taliban in Afghanistan flooded our newspapers. Thus, as Jasmine Zayn notes, the Muslim woman then is caught between two representational oppressions. On the one hand, Western representations of Muslim women as backward, oppressed, and politically immature women in need of liberation and rescue through imperialist interventions, and on the other, internal Muslim religious extremism and Puritan discourses that authorize equally limiting narratives of Islamic womanhood and compromise their human rights and liberty. Now, both representations, the ahistorical third world difference that is symbolically rendered into images of veiled women in need of intervention and rescue, and the nativist discourse of rendering women as symbolic of religious and cultural authenticity, both of these representations affect the lives of Muslim women, depending on where they are. However, they detract from the historically and institutionally grounded challenges that Muslim women do in fact face. And today I would like to talk about a few of these, beginning with discursive treatments of women based on the Quran and its medieval interpretations. So the first question we may ask is, does the Quran, Islam's holy book, make women secondary to men? There is no question that the Quran offers both sexes moral and spiritual equality and dignity. For instance, the Quran makes no differentiation between the soul of a woman and the soul of a man. Female life is intrinsically valuable, and God creates all things in pairs, and there is no mention of the female as having been created from a male or to serve the male. However, both men and women are judged on their piety and righteousness, and are both equally accountable to God for their moral decisions and actions. However, there are verses pertaining to the social and legal spheres that Muslims have traditionally interpreted as giving men rights over women. Women are to inherit half the percentages allotted to men, and 2 women's testimony is worth that of 1 male. The most problematic verses in the Quran are 434, chapter 4, verse 34, which ostensibly authorizes husbands to beat their disobedient wives, and Quran chapter 4, verse 3, which allows men to marry up to 4 women. The central or key issue here surrounds how the Quran is to be interpreted. Are these verses binding for all Muslims over all time, or are they to be viewed as speaking to their historical context? In the Quran itself, there are only some 200 verses out of 7,000 verses that speak of legal matters. As you can see, Islamic law relied on a number of sources in developing what we normally call the Sharia. Here we need to recognize 2 important factors that affect how Islamic law deals with women. First, the Quran does not endow women with specific characteristics relating to their sex, what we call essentialism in gender theoretical circles, the idea that women are inherently weak, inferior, emotional, etc. However, the rapid expansion of Muslims into Byzantine and Persian territories exposed Muslims to societies that were patriarchal long before the Quran was revealed in the 7th century. Patriarchal interpretations of the Quran and patriarchal social institutions both entered Islamic intellectual and social arenas with the expansion of the Muslim empire, at the same time as when Muslim legal schools were being formulated. A case in point is that in the Quran, the first female, named extra-Quranically as Hawa, or the figure that we know as Eve from biblical sources, is not created from the rib of Adam, nor is she responsible for succumbing to Satan's lure, as is Eve in the biblical tradition. However, male scholars who collected traditions of the Prophet and wrote Quranic commentaries imported such biblical notions from Jewish and Christian sources into the Islamic understanding of Hawa or Eve. As a result, the story that Eve was created from the rib of the male, Adam, was imported into Islam, and with it attitudes towards women, which played a key role in how verses pertaining to women were interpreted by Muslims. Thus, even though the Quran says no such thing, women were made not only subordinate to men, but from biblical sources, they also gave women characteristics such as being weak, in need of protection, ruled by their emotions, subject to the pain of childbirth, seductive, and responsible for the fall of men from their heavenly state. Jewish and Christian feminist women have had to reclaim their equality before men in pointing to another Genesis account, which is Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 27. Now, this is just to basically say that in a sense now, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women all had to do the same kind of work to sort of restore the dignity of women from their sacred sources. At this juncture, I want to turn to some examples of how contemporary Muslim women scholars are rereading the Quran in a way that seeks to restore what they see as the Quran's essential egalitarianism. As Isabel Coleman has observed in her study of women in Muslim societies, she looks at Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan as examples. Progressive Muslim men and women, whom she terms quiet revolutionaries, are using Islamic feminism to change the terms of the religious debate, to fight for women's rights within Islam instead of against it. Thus we find Rifat Hassan laying the groundwork for revisiting interpretations of the Quran in noting that the woman was neither created from the male, for the male, or as secondary to him. Her work opens up the possibility of considering the autonomous ethical imperative and agency that belongs to a woman, regardless of her biology. Amina Wadud and Asma Barlas both argue against reading Quranic verses selectively and out of context, making the case instead that the Quran has to be read holistically within the context in which the relevant verses were revealed, and take into account the cultures in which it was both revealed, 7th century Arabia, and interpreted, Byzantine and Persian cultures. Not to do so, they argue, would compromise the Quran's ability to be an eternally valid text of guidance for Muslims, regardless of time and place. Wadud suggests that any Quranic hermeneutic must distinguish between what she calls the spirit of the Quran, by which she means the ethical principles of the Quran, and the socially regulatory verses of the Quran that spoke to the 7th century Arabian contexts in which they were revealed. Thus, the goal of her work is to read the Quran from within the female experience and without the stereotypes which have been the framework for many of the male interpretations. Thus, for instance, through careful philological work, she shows that the words Kawamuna Allah in the verse that claims that men are a degree over women, contains within its lexical field the idea that men are a support to women, which actually makes more sense in the verse, as the verse would then read, men bear responsibility for women only when what God has given to one excels over what has been given to the other, and when they, men, spend their wealth on maintaining the women of the household. This verse has been interpreted to mean that all women must obey their husbands, and if they do not, they should be beaten. Again, philologically, the word strike could also mean admonish, which would then be a verbal, not a physical reprimand. Regardless, by reading the Quran in the light of its principles concerning ethics and morals and social justice, Wadud argues that this particular text must be read as being restricted to the particular 7th century Arabian context in which it was revealed. Furthermore, turning to the example of the Prophet himself, Prophet Muhammad that is, she finds that he never struck a woman. Given how important the example of the Prophet is for all Muslims to follow, she argues that Muslim men cannot justify beating their wives. Further, the fact that Islamic law interpreted this verse as a restriction of violent beating confirms a textual understanding against the use of this verse for unabashed spousal abuse or domestic violence. Asma Barlas takes on the medieval context in which the interpretations of the Quran were developed, largely the Byzantine and Persian cultural codes that were prevalent in the areas in which the Islamic empire was expanding. Specifically, she addresses masculine interpretations of the Quran that gave greater authority in all matters to men, in keeping with their Christian and Jewish counterparts, who did the same in their religious traditions. Thus, she examines the Quran for examples of traditional patriarchy, especially in the form of patriarchal marriage, in which the distinction between the father and the husband is blurred. The father-husband is designated as God's surrogate on earth, establishing the woman-wife as his property or child and as someone over whom he has authority. She argues instead that the Quran not only does not link the rights of fathers and husbands in this way, but it also does not appoint either one a ruler or guardian over his wife and children, or even as the head of the household. Nor does it designate the wife and children as the man's property or require them to be submissive in him. So, for instance, the Quran counsels children to be kind to their parents in their old age, and re-emphasizes that even parents have no right to make children obey them in worshiping someone other than God. The verse suggests that a human being, whether male or female, is free to disobey parents in matters of faith, thereby bringing home Barlas's point that the Quran does not view as legitimate the sanctity of the father's rule or traditional views of fathers as heads of household. That is, the Quran does not regard the father as representative of God's representative on earth. And further, his authority is not to be regarded as an extension of God's authority. A close reading of the Quran, therefore, suggests that traditional Muslim patriarchal understandings linking father right and paternal privilege as symbolic of God on earth is a misreading of the Quran. What about veiling? Muslim legal schools emulated the Byzantine and Persian societies in which they found themselves, where both veiling and seclusion were markers of high status for Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian women. Let me underscore this point. If you were a good woman, in contrast to a fallen woman, you wore the veil. Indeed, women of low class or women who wanted to signal that they were available for men were either forbidden to veil or did not veil. Thus, medieval Muslim jurists drew upon verses in the Quran to make the practices of veiling and or seclusion applicable to all Muslim women in conformance with the traditions of the non-Muslim communities in the conquered domains. The verses they drew upon were verses such as the Quran's command to women to draw their scarves, kumor, around their bosoms, and to draw their cloaks, jilbab, around themselves when outdoors so that they may be recognized and not be harassed. The Quran further asks that the wives of the Prophet be approached from behind a curtain or a hijab, meaning a physical curtain that would divide space in a room, for example. Such verses were utilized by medieval Muslim jurists to turn a physical barrier, a hijab, into a portable barrier, the veil, adopting conventions observed by the non-Muslim women in the conquered domains. Ironically, the spirit of protection underlying the cloak verse has today come to be viewed as a sign of oppression of Muslim women by their menfolk and their religion, in contrast to the original intent of the verses to uphold standards of modesty and afford protection to women in public spaces, and that at that time were in keeping with the customs of upper-class Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian women. Thus, although veiling in the sense of covering one's head, and in some instances the face, is not explicitly mandated by the Quran, it marks a historical development in medieval Muslim legal and customary practice to signal prestige and conformance with local practices in the Jewish, Christian, and Persian domains of the Islamic Empire. Let me now turn to two questions. The first question is why Muslim family law has not developed in the same way that laws governing other features of Muslim societies have. Now, Sharia denotes the divine and moral principles behind the system of Islamic law and is not monolithic. Behind the system of Islamic law, and Islamic law itself is not monolithic. The correct term for the application of Islamic law or the application of Sharia is actually fiqh, but nobody uses that term. Everybody understands Sharia to be Islamic law, so that's what we'll use here. There are differences of interpretation and application across the various Sunni and Shia legal schools. So much so that there is in fact no one Sharia law for all women. Islamic law has continually been revised and added to over the course of centuries in keeping with the needs of society. During the time of the Islamic empires, which lasted until the Ottoman Empire that ended in 1919, the caliphs took over significant portions of the law under their control, including commercial law, constitutional law, the laws governing foreign relations, for example. Ironically, in the last decades of the three Muslim empires, which are the Persian Empire, the Mughal Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, with increased contact with Western nations, the state legal system in the Muslim empires incorporated features of the French, British, and Roman codes of law, and in so doing also imported European prejudices against women. Then, during the period of colonial British rule over majority Muslim societies such as Egypt, as well as India, the British impecular administrative code, but left clearly oppressive family laws in the hands of religious authorities by declaring that these were of divine origin and therefore should not be touched. Some would argue that the British were in fact retaining the patriarchal advantage, as it was not in their interest to promote the rights of women. at the same time that they criticized Egyptian Muslims on how they treated Muslim women. They closed down schools for Muslim women, thereby ensuring that women would not have social advantages through education. Such fixing of legal codes meant that Sharia law, which until the modern period was not fixed and continually able to adjust itself in paying attention to changing social needs, was now turned into a fixed, divinely ordained body of laws pertaining to women. Muslim legal regimes adopted French or British definitions of family and the family's role in the modern nation state. The European model emphasized family stability and limited divorce rights, largely on the basis of Christian doctrine, in order to solidify citizen relations for the ultimate purpose of state control and planning in the political and economic realms. Such an emphasis on family law and divorce rights contradicted Islamic marriage, which was until then simply a contract among other contracts and not so rigidly defined as a sacrament. In other words, the argument I'm trying to make is that had Sharia law been left alone and not been subjected to colonial intervention, that is, colonial fixing, one could speculate that as Muslim societies entered the modern era, they would have adjusted their laws pertaining to family and to women according to social needs. As it stands now, they have internalized the British-induced idea that family law is divinely originated. Therefore, changing family law becomes synonymous with trying to change Islam. The second question is why it is that we see women increasingly taking on the veil in Muslim societies that had earlier in the 20th century begun to take it off. Here we must note that in almost every case, the veiling or reveiling of women is attributable in part also to post-colonial developments. We must remember that every Muslim country has been under colonial rule with the exception of 3 countries: Saudi Arabia, which was under the British mandate, Iran, which nonetheless saw much intervention in its affairs by the British, the French, and the Russians, and Turkey, which is what was left when the Ottoman Empire was disbanded by the Allied powers after the First World War. I only have a few minutes left, and I'm conscious that I'm running out of time. Lord Cromer, the British governor of Egypt, who opposed female suffragettes in England, nonetheless felt he had to be a feminist in Egypt. He identified Muslim societies as backward and in need of civilization and Christianization, on the grounds that a sign of their backwardness was the manner in which such societies treated their women by veiling and secluding them. Leila Ahmed, who is a Harvard historian of gender in Islam, has astutely observed how the resistance narrative of Muslims both reversed and ironically accepted the terms set in the first place by the colonizers. In response to such attacks as those of Lord Cromer on their culture and religion, anti-colonial movements in Muslim societies reversed the colonial narrative, such that the adoption of the veil, whether enforced or voluntary, came to symbolize in the resistance narrative, not the inferiority of the culture and the need to cast aside its customs in favor of those of the West, but on the contrary, the dignity and validity of all native customs, and in particular, those customs coming under fiercest colonial attack, the customs relating to women, and the need to tenaciously affirm them as a means of resistance to Western domination. Doing so, however, also re-entrenched Muslim patriarchal elites, and thus Muslim women find that their bodies are the battleground on which struggles for power and authenticity are being waged. So contrary to Kipling's tired old trope that East is East and West is West, never the twain shall meet, I have attempted to show here that a historical examination reveals that, in fact, East and West are more intertwined than one could have imagined, which is, in fact, exactly what the next line of Kipling's famous poem says. Up to this point, I have pointed to the fact that the Quran's verses on women were interpreted in a patriarchal fashion, largely due to Byzantine, Christian, and Persian Zoroastrian contexts in which Muslims found themselves. Further, I have tried to point out that Sharia laws are not standard, vary from Muslim majority country to country, and that the colonial fixing of legal codes had an adverse effect on laws pertaining to women. And finally, that the colonial attack on Islam has reinforced Muslim calls on women to veil in order to mark their difference from their former colonial masters on the one hand, and to resist westernization on the other. So it is this complicated situation that Muslim gender activists have to deal with in their own countries. They find themselves increasingly called to argue for reform on matters pertaining to personal status codes and family law by reinterpreting Islamic foundational and authoritative texts. This is so because an appeal to secularism is simply seen as caving into Western values at a time when both the memory of Western colonization and of the privations caused by Western economic globalization, which is seen as a continuation of Western imperialism, are being keenly felt. Thus, veiling, whether imposed by increasing Islamism or chosen by the woman herself, signifies any number of things. It is worn as an expression of faith and piety. It is worn as a resurgence of pride in being Muslim. It is worn as a form of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist resistance. It is worn as a cultural signal of being a good and chaste woman. And finally, as a way for Muslim women to claim public space through signaling an unequivocal membership in the Muslim community, and hence the right to assert their agency. So, for example, Shirin Hafez's 2003 study of two Islamists, or what in popular discourse here are called fundamentalist women's organizations in Cairo, Egypt, notes, is that women involved in these organizations were united around the common goal of perfecting themselves as a means of gaining proximity to God. While their activities comprised preaching, giving religious lessons, teaching illiterate girls, and working for philanthropic causes. Her study attempts to show that even though Islamists are perceived as opposing women's liberation in Egypt, Islamic women's activism has produced a movement that redefines women's social roles in placing women in the public sphere. Although they are driven by the desire to be closer to God, their activities dismantle the myths that have impeded the participation of women in religious, social, and political arenas of the country. The paradox here lies in that these women accede to ritual forms of behavior and male authority in their search for religious perfection, while nonetheless their activities are aimed at welfare for women in society and lead to forms of empowerment for the women concerned. Noting that Islamist women activists pose a serious challenge to researchers because they do not subscribe to a feminist agenda, Hafez found that for these women, Islam, like feminism, is employed as a framework for women who struggle to seek improvements in society, but additionally as a means of gaining higher levels of religiosity and proximity to God. And Hafez notes that these women have been able, precisely because they are so strongly identified with being pious Muslim women, to challenge male domination over society and to address conditions that undermine women, such as illiteracy, lack of health care, poverty, and to influence decision-making. What is even more surprising is that Hafez found that even though their goals and identities are based on established religious conviction, Islamist women activists are themselves also constituted and formed by modernity, and in a surprising turn, embody secular liberal views that often see the individual as both free and independent, while they're simultaneously acting according to what they perceive as divine will and sovereignty. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for giving me a little bit of extra time. Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Kassam for sharing with us the rich traditions of feminist interpretation of the Quran and Muslim practices. She has underscored the development of some of these Muslim practices surrounding the family and women have been developed in interaction with Jewish, Christian, and Persian culture, and they have been influenced by colonial and post-colonial realities. Our second presenter is Dr. Aruna Gnanadason, who is a member of the Church of South India and joins us from Chennai. She was the director of the global program on women in church and society and the justice, peace, and creation work of the World Council of Churches. Before that, she headed the All Indian Council of Christian Women of the National Council of Churches in India. She is presently national convener of the Indian Christian Women's Movement. Her publications include Listened to the Women, Listened to the Earth, With Courage and Compassion, Women and the Ecumenical Movement, and Gender Justice and the Church, as well as many other articles and chapters. Please welcome Dr. Gnanadason.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Qu'ran. And I really want to start by thanking Zayn for that amazing presentation. I learned so much, so I'm sure that all of us have learned a lot from your presentation, Zayn. You set the basic text for us today. So my job becomes much easier because you have helped us understand just how powerful and rich Islam is in its relationships to women. I thank you so much, and I'm sure that all of us, I hope, will get a copy of the PowerPoint because we can keep on listening to it because we can learn so much from your presentation. Thank you, Qu'ran, to have included me in this, Dr. Qu'ran, for including me in this morning session or evening for you. I think this kind of discussions are really important for us today in our world, where we look together at the role religion plays in our lives. My presentation is much more focused on India, the situation now in India, and the need for greater understanding and building of solidarity between Muslim and Christian women, particularly, and all women of all religions, because we are living at a time when religion is being used to keep us apart, and to create all kinds of misrepresentations and about women. So my focus is a little different from what Zayn has done, but we needed Zayn's presentation if my presentation has to make any sense. I want to focus on the power of the women's movement and how much in India it has affected me, influenced me, and been my inspiration. Because over the decades, a bit of my time went away when I went to the World Council of Churches, but I came back to the women's movement in India. It is a powerful movement of women of all faiths coming together. And if there are any improvements in the conditions of women in this country, it's because of the power of the women's movement, which has brought all kinds of issues to the fore and has helped the country to deal with issues like violence against women, gang rapes of women. You read all about Indian women and all these stories. Not that they happen all the time, but of course, they are all sensational, so they are in the news. And all laws have been amended. Almost every law has been amended because of the interventions of women. We have, since our colonial rulers left, it is only in the last few decades that many laws have been made more humane and people-centered, if not women-centered. And I want to start by giving one success story of how, when women pick up their minds, how they can organize and bring forward issues powerfully. You may know that we have, for the past 7 years, had a Hindutva-inspired political movement. Hindutva being an ideology that the Hindus have put together to govern. And we have that as our ideology that is inspiring our leaders to do all that is happening. The secular, democratic fabric of the Indian society is slowly being eroded. And as women, we discovered how important it is for us to speak. So in 2020, a movement began in India, which was called If We Do Not Rise. It was a campaign, a national level campaign. Thousands of men and women got involved in it. Some 600 organizations of women across India were engaged in it. And this included the LGBTQIA groups, women's groups, Dalit groups, the indigenous peoples groups, human rights, trade union, farmers, environmentalists, journalists. Every category of women and men got involved in this national movement. It reached thousands of people across the country, and it was all online because we could not meet in public spaces because of the coronavirus and lockdowns, etc. But it was an amazing movement which showed that women will not be silenced even by a virus. Because we have seen the collapse of every democratic institution, the law courts, even the parliament, everything has collapsed. And we're slowly moving into, as a journalist has put it, into elected autocracy. So it's a very sort of dangerous moment in Indian history just now. And everything, all institutions have been compromised. Laws like the ones on the right to information, the right to dissent, all these are being eroded slowly, and we are moving into a sort of autocratic state. So in the midst of a raging coronavirus, I don't know whether you know it, but India has the second largest number of infected people in the world. And it's purely because of mismanagement. If other countries, particularly in Asia, have done so well, India had no excuse. We have the biggest institutions, medical institutions, and for production of medicines, etc. And yet, the basic vaccine, which Indians should be getting only 3% of Indian population is vaccinated so far. So the third phase of this virus, the third attack of the virus, is going to come on us very soon, because India's, again, for the third time, ill-prepared to handle it. Let me give you a picture of India's religious demography. Out of a population of over 1.3 billion people, we have the second largest population in the world. Of this population, 79.8 or 80% of the people are Hindus or practice Hinduism. 14.2% adhere to Islam, and just 2.3% of the population are Christians. And the rest of the population represent other religious groups like Buddhism, Jainism, etc. There is a claim made largely by the majoritarian government and people of the Hindutva that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, in India, and therefore there is this fear that this is a threat that is going to be posed on the Hindu community. Now, in the past few decades, Indian Christian women have been strongly influenced by the women's movement in society. And we have developed new methodologies and hermeneutical principles for reading and understanding the Word of God. So in India, Bible and our faith in a liberator God has been a source of inspiration and hope. The Bible and our faith is not easily rejected by Indian Christian women. We are strongly Christian in our convictions. And ironically, that same Bible has been used against women, even by our faith tradition. And there are arguments from the Bible which is used selectively to domesticate women, and the church has domesticated most women, and most women have accepted the androcentric, and if I may add, anthropocentric interpretation of the salvation message, inhibiting our engagement in the struggles for life, or even in knowing what is happening in the economic and political life of the country, especially in the life of other religious minorities. So unfortunately, we as Christians too have deep-rooted prejudices against the Muslim community, which is a real shame because we are the two major minorities in the country. Additionally, in India, even those women who are active in the feminist movement hesitate to speak about from a faith perspective or to explore a new spirituality that we could derive out of our faith traditions to fuel our resistance movements. But in recent months, as we as Christian women are engaging more and more in this ecumenical organization of women, a feminist liberationist organization of women, we are recognizing the liberation potential of our faith. Feminist theologians, ordained women, women in religious orders, and lay women from many Christian traditions have come together to form this Indian Christian women's movement. And they are looking at the Bible from a completely new perspective as a a source of hope for us to work together with other Christian women, other religious women. So it has been the foundation for us to work with women of other faiths. And that is so important, what is happening now. Because all our faith traditions, and Zayn has so beautifully brought out how Islam also has this a deep stream of liberation. The liberation message is at the center of all our faiths. But all our faiths, as she has pointed out, have been influenced by deeply patriarchal biases, which have in one way or the other been used to legitimize the second-class status that is meted to women in our own religious traditions and in the society. So, unfortunately, our religious traditions have been at the heart of the discrimination and violence that many women of faith experience. We also see again and again the way religious sentiments are used by vested interests to create a culture of fear in India. In the past 5 or 6 years, the ruling dispensation has used this form of Hinduism that has evoked the Hindutva or India for Hindus ideology, and which is wreaking havoc in the country. And a very intolerant Hindutva agenda has emerged. There is no question that this trend of the politicization of religion has affected the well-established traditions of religious tolerance and communal harmony, which have existed in India and which is in fact, in my understanding, is what India is about. It is this heart of India. But this is being eroded. The majoritarian Hindutva ideology has organized society on the basis of a caste hierarchy and has given religious legitimacy to upper castes and has marginalized a large part of the Indian population as outcasts. So to discuss this must be a part of the agenda of the women's movement as we try to relate to each other in this very complex country. And therefore, any dialogue between women of faith has to address some of these tough questions. Because we have to recognize that Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims are not part of, in the constitution, of people who have been given preferential option, preferential treatment, the preferential rights which are given to Dalit Hindus is not accorded to Christian Dalits and Muslim Dalits. We are counted outside the frame of the society. So it's important for us, therefore, to work with Muslim Dalit women and among us to challenge some of these injustices. The Christian movement here has begun to talk about how restless we are for justice, how restless we are to reclaim our faith as a liberation message and to proudly declare it as a voice of hope in the country. As I think Zayn is saying, Islam should do. Muslim women should reclaim their faith in that way. And I believe that Christians also should do the same thing. Now, we are going through a very critical phase in our history because 2 years or a few years ago, I should say, the Hindu majority government began a process of a citizenship amendment process, which intentionally excludes Muslims from citizenship in the country, where this is the first time in the history of India, religion is being used as a basis for citizenship. The beauty of India has been that all religions have come and have become citizens of this country, and there has been no problem about that. But in more recent times, there has been this attempt at framing citizenship on the basis of religion. The Constitution of India declares India as a sovereign, socialist, secular, and democratic republic. But that is being eroded. At the moment, there is this registration of people to identify people according to their faith traditions. And clearly that law clearly identifies Muslims as having to prove their right to live in the country. They need a document, and most of them do not have documents from several generations ago to prove that they are citizens of the country. Ironically, India does not have any evidence of undocumented immigration being a problem on a large scale. It has never happened. There are, of course, strange claims that so many Muslims have come into the country illegally and they are destroying the fabric of Indian society. But there's no documented evidence that this has happened. And yet, a national registration of citizenship is being followed very rigorously by the dominant group in the country just now. In a country where Muslims have traditionally and institutionally experienced poverty and inequalities in education and other means of development, it is estimated that several millions, and we're talking about millions of Muslims, may suddenly be stateless in the country. They'll be rendered stateless by the government. And that only fuels more and more Islamophobia, because the government institutionalizes it. And therefore, naturally, there is a growing Islamophobia in the country. Even as we speak, a small island called Lakshadweep, which is just off the coast of India, a majority Muslim population lives there, but it's been a serene place, a quiet place, environmentally absolutely perfect. Not a single case of the coronavirus was found there. This country, this little island, the Indian government has suddenly decided should be developed. It should be claimed more by India. So they have imposed a kind of government there, which has taken control. And one of the first things this man did was to bring in a ban on beef. Beef, which is the basic diet of Muslims, especially the poor Muslims in the country. So it is directly hitting at the heart of that community who have lived peacefully over there for decades, if not centuries. And then a little over a year ago, the state of Kashmir was deprived of its statehood, because there too, it is a largely Muslim country. and was governed by Muslims. And they are another of the most beautiful parts of India. But on the claim that there are a lot of terrorists who have come there and are living there and are using that space, the Indian government is slowly taking it away. In fact, they have even, there are very clear ways in which outsiders are being taken there to occupy exactly what is happening, for instance, in Palestine, where the land is being taken away from the Muslims who owned it and being given to big business houses from other communities all over India. Fortunately, Muslim women have organized themselves superbly against the citizenship laws. And there is hope, because in spite of the virus, which has disturbed their movement, they're just waiting for the country to be cleared so they can come back. More than 1,000 women, burqa clad or veils, women in veils as you would understand it, but in India we call it the burqa. So 1,000 burqa clad women in all the metropolitan cities for 2 months stayed in that place, night and day, 24 hours a day. There were 1,000 women in each of these locations wearing their burqas and sitting there to protest against the citizenship law. So there is a movement of women which is growing. And what was amazing about it is those movements, of course, men must have been involved with them in some way. But when we visited these places, we have seen that the men are sitting on the sides and it's the women, Muslim women, taking leadership and have organized themselves. The Indian Christian Women's Movement sent a strongly worded letter to the Prime Minister protesting against the citizenship law and urging that it be thrown out. That we as Christian women do not want Muslim women to be counted out in any citizenship way. Just to say that there have been some talk going on among the Hindutva ideologues. Now it is the Muslims, next it will be the Christians. So we are going to be their target of attack at some point. So what we as Christian women did was, as to show a form of solidarity with our Muslim sisters, we organized a campaign called "You Are Part of Me." This is what Jesus said to Simon Peter, that when Simon told him not to wash his feet, Jesus told him, if you want to be part of me, then allow me to wash your feet. So we took that symbol and decided that in all these places where Muslim women are protesting, we would go as Christian women and with them organize a little ceremony and wash the feet of the Muslim women in a public display of how we feel that Muslim women are a part of us. So this elaborate plan was all laid out for the Easter season of in fact, it was in 2020, we wanted to do this. We were all set to do it when the government imposed the first total ban all over the country. So we were not allowed to do it. The police just stopped us from going there. So everything was disbanded, even the 1,000 women were disbanded. And we could not have this public display of our solidarity with Muslim women. But I know that it is there. And the moment it is possible, we will reenact this symbolic way of showing our solidarity with women. For us, this proposed action of washing the feet of Muslim women responds to a deep feminist theological compulsion and marks a radical shift from the church as a stultified institution to church as event. A rereading of the text of John 13, 1-17 inspired us to adopt this sacred symbol of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples in making the much maligned and harassed Muslim women a part of us. So this movement is still there. It will come back after the COVID-19 is behind us. The initial contacts with Muslim women opened us to the reality that solidarity between these two minority groups is a way forward for women in this country. In fact, we have come to the realization that we have to walk with women of all faiths as Christians. As Christian women, we too feel silenced by the fear of political stifling of our voices, as well as restrictions over our lives and our contributions by the state, but also by our patriarchal families, societies, and even our churches, which are overcautious at the moment of their minority status and fear of losing control and power. Like the disciples who hid in the upper room, fearing retribution on that Easter Sunday morning, today those of us with power in church and society hide in fear, in the sanctity and silencing and numbing other worldly theologies, coupled with our diffidence and fear to boldly confront injustice. Thus, we shut out the cries for life from the least in Indian society. Fortunately, there is a growing acceptance that religion must not be rejected, as it is so intimate a part of Indian culture. But it is crucial to wrest it from the hands of right-wing patriarchal groups who are using religion, even in the Christian community, for their own political interests. Feminist theory just has to become more inclusive, simply because of its revolutionary potential for all women. In the context of the political vacuum created by globalization and the politically skewed world we are living in, what we need to keep central is the constant threat to the viability and power of feminism as a revolutionary movement, which is of critical importance to all of us and to the future of the world. Feminism's power, however we name it in our context, as a political, social, and cultural alternative paradigm cannot be underestimated. The multi-layered experiences of women, their often unrecorded stories in history, as well as in myths, traditions, proverbs, art and dance and other forms of expression, have all been a source for the women's movement in India, and which has been used to speak truth to power and to influence how political spaces can be widened to include all women's contributions in the fullest sense. An alternative feminist epistemology, which is based on a commitment to transform hierarchical structures of power and injustice and to uncover the liberation potential of our cultures and religions, is the way forward. Feminist epistemology, in my understanding, is the desire to seek alternatives that are based on an ethic of care, compassion, and mutuality in relationships. In Christ, we as Christian women find the resources for such an exploration together with women of all other faiths, seeking similar liberation motives in the faith traditions each of us represent. Thank you.
I want to thank Aruna for this wonderful presentation. She has underscored the troubling situation in current India, where religion intersects with politics, and she highlights the importance of interreligious solidarity and shares with us how Christian women and Muslim women have worked for the justice of society. Now, I would like to invite Zayn and Aruna to come on the screen so that we can have questions and answers. The first question is directed to Zayn. How the scholars with their research, study, and writing on Quran study influence the policy or regulation on patriarchal systems which have been oppressing women? Is there any progress?
Thank you very much for that question. That's always a question that we have to think about. That is the work that's done in the academy, does it actually have any effect on people's actual lives, right? And the example that comes to mind is this one, that Professor Amina Wadud, after she received her doctorate, did not find a job here, and in fact was offered a position in Malaysia, I believe. And there she met up with a group of women, you know, a lawyer, a doctor, and other women, and they began to talk about the situation of Muslim women in Malaysia. And they decided collectively to found this organization called Sisters in Islam. And they first began by reading the Quran together. And, you know, Professor Wadud kind of like talked to them about the egalitarian verses in the Quran and also the importance of reading with an eye to context, and also sort of trying to identify what the spirit of the Quran, what the intention of the Quran was. And Sisters in Islam has now grown to be an organization based on that kind of feminist epistemology and feminist understanding of what the Quran's liberative potential is. That they went on to then take on, you know, the state in terms of the laws that were governing, you know, Muslim women's lives. They looked at the issue of violence against women. They looked at the issue of divorce against women and, you know, what that reduces women to, because women don't necessarily get any kind of support after they're divorced, apart from, you know, whatever was promised at the time that they got married, which quite often in real dollars worth made very little contribution to the ability for a woman to support herself. All kinds of practical on-the-ground issues were then taken up by Sisters in Islam. And then Sisters in Islam had the brilliant idea that they would actually collaborate with Muslim women's organizations in other parts of the in other Muslim majority societies to see if there were common issues that they were all facing, or what the issues were in their particular context that they could kind of work out strategies. So a transnational kind of impact began to take place. So this is just one example. Rifat Hassan is another such person who, you know, I've already mentioned Rifat Hassan. She sort of started off with this idea of, you know, women's equality in the Quran and dignity in the Quran. And she went to Pakistan and worked with General Musharraf, who was then the president of Pakistan, to basically have take on honor killings right? And got him to change the law and actually tighten up and create a commission that would look at honor killings. So there is real world impact to the intellectual work we do. Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. The second question is from a participant who says, I see that the challenge to create women's solidarity today is that many women do not like to see the progress of other women. They see other women as a rival, or women who work in the public sphere feel better than women in the domestic sphere. How do we face these challenges? Maybe we can start with Aruna.
It's really tragic, Yolande, that we as women tend to do this. We think about this question more than anything else. It comes up in so many discussions among us as women. I think men behave like that too, but somehow when men do it, it's not considered to be strange. But when women do it, there's always this women are bitchy to each other, women do not appreciate other women, etc., etc. It goes on. But I don't believe that is true. In the women's movement in India, I am seeing just how much we work together. For instance, we've had, the famous farmers movements. You must be reading about it. There are the huge protests which have continued for almost a year. The farmers have been protesting because of the fear of commercialization of farming. There's a big women farmers movement. Now, women farmers in India are not the ones with the big farms and the big bulldozers, etc. They are small farmers. They are simple women working their lives off. How much of solidarity there was among educated women from the cities, from universities, etc., with those women. So I believe that when solidarity is needed, women are the first to reach out, whichever group of women we are working with. Of course, human nature, there could be some problems among women, but then those exist even among men. But for some reason, it's always women's treatment of each other which is picked up, and then there is a sort of a rift created among us by comments such as that of women can't work with each other. They have their rivalries and intellectual rivalries or whatever. So I just, men are perhaps cleverer at hiding some of their problems than we women are. We are much more transparent and open, and therefore it appears as if there are more problems among women than there are among men. So I just would say that this is, it's a trap that sometimes entraps us as women. We should watch out and continue in our efforts to reach out as all women, because we as women truly, truly need each other. Whether you are a woman from a farm, whether you're a domestic worker, whether you are a woman who is a sex worker, whatever you are, we as women in the world need each other, and that should be the way in which we go forward.
Thank you very much. We have a question for Zayn. This is about veiling. The veil has been used also by dominant power in society and by the ruling political party to control the lives of women. What model of resistance is best from post-colonial feminist perspective and with interfaith approach?
Thank you for that question. And that is in fact quite true, that we do find that there are some countries, Islamic governments, that are reimposing the veil as a sign of true belonging, authenticity of being a Muslim society, that women veil, right? And I already talked in my talk earlier about how this is in a sense an appropriation of the colonial kind of like blaming the society for being weak and being oppressive to women because of the veil. So the veil is now actually a very powerful symbol of authenticity of being Muslim. That said, the thing is that Denise Candioti has a very interesting kind of theoretical framing that I found quite useful. And that is, she talks about how women negotiate with patriarchy. So given that this is a form of state patriarchy, right, where the will of the state is being imposed upon the individual agency of women, then women actually, nothing is taken away from their intelligence or their agency if they have to put a piece of cloth over their heads. Mm-hmm. Rather, their agency, putting the veil on, gives them then the right to say, yes, we are full citizens of this country, we're going to enter the public sphere, and we're going to do the activist work we need to do. And then it would really help us if Jewish, Christian, Persian, other women did not kind of point fingers at us and say, look, you're veiling, so you're oppressed by your men. But rather, if they came out in solidarity with us and said, okay, what are the real issues that we need to deal with? Do we have equal access to healthcare, to education, to the workplace, to any number of things? The challenges for equity do not go away in any society in the world, even the most supposedly advanced society, which is right here in the US, right? So I think that this is something to be borne in mind, that maybe negotiating with patriarchy is just one of the things that you do, but you don't take your eyes off the goal, which is to have equity for all peoples, all genders, all abilities.
Thank you.
Could I add something to that?
Yes, please.
I told you about this demonstrations of women. I mean, you have to see it to believe it. Yeah. That 1,000 women are sitting there and on the ground. It's a sit down protest. So they all sit on the ground and they're singing. There's some dancing going on in one place. There's a drama going on, street theater going on in one place. They're all veiled. Even the little girls are veiled. For me, it was so powerful. It was as if they were using it as a political weapon. They were not going to give up their identity for the sake of citizenship. That's it, simple as that. Right. I think that, you see, the veil has been, unfortunately, it is the whole concept of veiling is part of the culture. I mean, in India, we have all kinds of cultures which make it sound as if women have to cover themselves in a particular way. Women must do this, women must do that. No, it's part of their culture. That's their dress. The way they wear a sari varies from culture to culture. But when you look at it as a symbol of oppression, which is not of their making, it comes from outside. Someone has made them believe that this is a symbol of oppression. So I just feel that it is like any other thing, we could be considered, there are so many things that we all do, which could be considered as culturally oppressing us, as making us feel less than men. So I think that it's a matter of recognizing, as Zayn said, it's how they use that power for liberation. That's what is important rather than what you see on the outside.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Dr. Kassam and Dr. Gnanadason for joining us today and for their wonderful presentations. And next week, please join us for the final session of the class. The topic will be on leadership and ministry. Our speakers will be Dr. Bongyong Lee and Dr. Satami Nakaba. I hope you will stay on for the Zoom meeting discussion. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for being here.